In the United States of America, we teach the haiku wrong. But I'm not making this video to bash on the American education system. I've spent over 25 years in it, and there's a lot to commend about it. But it's not perfect, and generally speaking, I think this is one area where we could improve. The average American student knows haiku are Japanese, 575 syllable count, and focused on nature. All this is well and good, but it leads to some pretty short-sighted perceptions of the form. The first is that students confuse the haiku's use of simplicity with simple writing. Many Americans see the haiku as meme adjacent, that all you have to do is count syllables, and because they're so short, they feel so much easier and inferior to forms like the sonnet. We'll get to why this is a misrepresentation of haiku in a second, but I want to call back to something else from that base knowledge that many students have of the form, the fact that it's Japanese. The problem is that this is the only form of Japanese literature that your average American student is ever exposed to. So when all they get is a lesson or two at most on what many of them see as simple poetry, it does an extreme disservice to an incredibly rich literary culture. So how do we address this? Well, I'm no authority on Japanese literature, but I think a great place to start is by looking at how the haiku arrived at its 575 structure and where it's going with it today. The haiku actually comes from a portion of a much longer poetic form called renga. The renga was a group poem that used complex rules to create alternating stanzas of 575 and 77 syllables, although it's important to point out that the English syllable is not the basis of any Japanese poetry. It's just our imperfect interpretation of it. The opening stanza, often considered one of the most important since it sets the tone for the whole renga, eventually became the freestanding haiku form that we recognize today. That last paragraph glosses over so many influential authors and critics over the last half millennia of poetic evolution that I'm embarrassed by it. But even so, it provides more of a foundation than the typical haiku lesson in the US, and I think this foundation is an essential part to better teaching haiku. Let's turn our attention away from history for a bit to look at the form itself. The emphasis on 575 is all fine and dandy, but if it stops there, it's sort of like saying any poem with 14 lines is a sonnet. There's more that goes into a sonnet than just the number of lines. Likewise, there's a lot more we could be teaching our students about haiku than just syllables. The first is brevity, no unnecessary words. The syllable count is actually more flexible in Japanese and in non-Japanese haikus. Brevity, however, is not. All haiku follow its guide, no unnecessary words. Seasonal focus. Traditionally, haiku all focus on a specific season: spring, summer, fall, winter, or New Year. A keyword known as the kigo helps indicate the season, but this is less strict than brevity. There exists haiku with no seasonal or even natural references of any sort. And finally, we have the cutting word, or kareiji. This word creates a pause, sense of wonder, or division in the haiku. It's worth noting that many of the haiku's technicalities are difficult to put into English equivalencies, especially the 575 syllable structure. But what students all over the world should be taught is that the haiku is a global form of poetry that's still being experimented with and expanded upon today. In fact, when the father of the modern haiku, Masaaku Shiki, died, his followers split into two groups: those that thought the form was finalized, and those who thought Shiki's work should continue to be expanded upon and evolve. So who's to say what a haiku actually is? The context of this debate makes conversations like this one on the Poetry Foundation's Instagram all that more ridiculous. The poem in question is Haiku by William J. Harris from the February 2023 issue of Poetry. It reads, "On the phone, my grandfather's voice, so frail. No, my father's. Obviously, with the title Haiku and the general layout the way it is, it invited comparisons to the form we've been talking about. But instead of the majority of commenters focusing on this incredible poem that captures a nuance of aging and how time speeds up and catches us off guard, it turned into a giant argument about whether or not this was a haiku. The top comment sums this up beautifully, saying, "The comment section here is why I had to move away from academia." The general readership of this post, who are, for the most part, I would assume people who love poetry, completely miss the point of this poem. It's not supposed to be a perfect haiku. It's not that William J. Harris is unaware of the 5-7-5 syllable structure. It's intentionally playing with that structure. It appears when you first start to read it to be a haiku, when in actuality it's not a strict haiku. Sort of like the grandfather's voice actually is the voice of the speaker's father. So there's this subversion of expectation that I think the title is playing into, but even if that's not the point that Harris is going for, it still works in the spirit of the haiku. Even if it doesn't have to do with nature how we usually think about it, people and their voices are nature. What this poem does capture that's along the lines of any great haiku is, in a very concise, short way, it notices something that might be overlooked. And that's what I think as teachers we have to really focus on with our students. Not that we don't introduce the 5-7-5, not that we don't talk about nature or the Japanese origin of the form. It's just that the 5-7-5 needs to be followed with a disclaimer. It's that nature can be broader than we think it is, and that this is not the only form of poetry in Japan, nor is it only written by people in Japan today. It's a global form of poetry, because people from all sorts of backgrounds and places have taken inspiration from this beautiful form. But if this video has only left you more confused about haiku than you were going into it, I'm, more confused about it now than I was going into making it. It's a more complex form than we often talk about in the American education system. But one quote that I came across, I think, really sticks out as to what this form can do for everyone. And it's what I'd like to end the video with, and something I'd encourage you to share with your students. This is from the author David Cobb, who edited a great, beautiful little collection of haiku from Japan. He says, "There is an understanding between poets and readers that every day is a good day, or at least that there is always some detail in the life going on around us, which is worthy of regard, respect, and possibly celebration." Now, I know not every haiku is positive, but a lot of them are, which is beautiful, because not a lot of art is positive. What I really want to latch on to here is that every day there's something worth noticing. And this beautiful form of poetry is better than any other form I've ever come across at reminding us of that fact. Thank you so much for watching. Happy reading.